Imagine a moment where the entire idea of how we use computers starts shifting under our feet. For decades, Windows and macOS have dominated personal computing, shaping how people work, play, and create. But quietly in the background, Linux has been evolving, not in loud marketing campaigns or flashy announcements, but through constant engineering progress, community-driven innovation, and a philosophy that refuses to stay locked into old limitations. And now something new has started to emerge inside the Linux ecosystem that feels less like a small update and more like a turning point. A change so fundamental that it could reshape the way operating systems are understood altogether. To understand why this matters, you have to step back and look at what has always held Linux back from mainstream dominance. It was never about performance or capability. In fact, Linux has always been ahead in many technical areas, from server infrastructure to supercomputers, cloud systems, and even Android devices. The real barrier was usability, fragmentation, and the lack of a unified desktop experience that could compete with the polished ecosystems of Windows and macOS. Different distributions, different package systems, inconsistent updates, driver headaches, and a general sense that Linux was powerful but not always convenient for everyday users kept it in a niche space on desktops. But that story has been changing piece by piece over the years. First came package standardization efforts like Snap and Flatpak, which started solving the nightmare of dependency issues. Then came improvements in desktop environments like GNOME and KDE Plasma, which slowly made Linux feel more modern and fluid. After that, gaming entered the picture in a way nobody expected, with Proton and Steam Play making thousands of Windows-only games playable on Linux with surprising performance. Suddenly, Linux was no longer just for developers and system administrators. It started becoming something that regular users could consider without fear. Now the latest shift is something deeper. It is not just a single feature, but a combination of architectural changes happening across the Linux ecosystem. The rise of immutable operating systems is one of the biggest parts of this transformation. Instead of the traditional model where every file and dependency can be changed at any time, immutable systems lock the core system into a read-only state. Updates are applied atomically, meaning the system either updates completely or not at all, eliminating broken states and failed upgrades. This approach drastically improves stability, especially for desktop users who just want their system to work without constant maintenance. At the same time, container-based application delivery is becoming the new default mindset. Applications are no longer deeply tied into the system in messy dependency chains. Instead, they are isolated, portable, and consistent across distributions. This removes one of the biggest historical weaknesses of Linux, which was fragmentation in software installation and compatibility. A Flatpak application, for example, behaves the same on different Linux systems, reducing the chaos that once made Linux feel inconsistent compared to Windows or macOS ecosystems. Another major evolution is happening at the graphics and display level. Wayland, the modern replacement for the aging X11 display server, is steadily becoming the standard. While X11 carried decades of legacy design, it struggled with modern needs like high refresh rates, better security isolation, and smooth multi-display scaling. Wayland solves many of these issues by redesigning how graphical output is handled at a fundamental level. The result is smoother animations, better performance in many scenarios, and improved security because applications cannot easily spy on each other's screen content anymore. When you combine immutable systems, containerized apps, and Wayland-based graphics, you start to see a pattern forming. Linux is slowly shifting from a traditional operating system model into something closer to a platform ecosystem. Instead of users managing the system manually, the system manages itself more intelligently while still giving users control when needed. This balance between control and simplicity is exactly what mainstream users have always wanted but rarely found in Linux. Another important layer of this transformation is happening in hardware support. For years, one of the biggest criticisms of Linux was driver compatibility. Graphics cards, Wi-Fi chips, printers, and specialized hardware often required manual configuration or did not work at all out of the box. But that is changing rapidly as companies increasingly contribute directly to the Linux kernel. NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel have all improved their Linux drivers significantly, and open-source driver development has reached a level where most modern hardware works seamlessly without user intervention. On top of that, the Linux kernel itself has become more adaptive and efficient. Features like better CPU scheduling, improved memory management, And optimized power usage mean Linux is not only stable but also extremely performant on modern hardware. In many benchmarks, Linux now outperforms Windows in server workloads and often matches or exceeds it in desktop responsiveness under certain conditions. But perhaps the most revolutionary part of this shift is not a single technical feature. It is the direction Linux is heading as a whole. The traditional idea of installing a Linux distribution, customizing every part of it, and manually maintaining system integrity is slowly being replaced by a more streamlined experience. New generations of Linux distributions are focusing on delivering a just works experience while still maintaining the openness and transparency that Linux is known for. This is where the comparison with Windows and macOS becomes interesting. Windows has built its strength on backward compatibility and widespread software support, but it also carries a lot of legacy baggage. macOS offers a highly polished and controlled ecosystem, but it is tightly locked into Apple hardware and a closed development model. Linux, on the other hand, is evolving into something that could potentially offer both flexibility and stability, without being tied to a single corporation's ecosystem. Imagine an operating system that updates itself without breaking anything, installs applications securely without dependency conflicts, runs games with near-native performance, supports virtually all modern hardware, and remains completely customizable for advanced users. That is the direction Linux is moving toward. And the most interesting part is that it is not being built by a single company. It is being built collectively by thousands of developers, organizations, and communities around the world. This decentralized development model is both Linux's greatest strength and its biggest challenge. On one hand, it allows innovation to happen rapidly and organically. On the other hand, it can sometimes lead to fragmentation and inconsistent user experiences. However, recent trends show a convergence happening. Major distributions are beginning to align around shared technologies like systemed, Wayland, Flatpak, and immutable base systems. This convergence is slowly reducing fragmentation and creating a more unified Linux experience. Gaming deserves special attention in this transformation because it is often the deciding factor for mainstream adoption. For years, gaming was the biggest reason users stayed on Windows. But with Valve's investment in Linux compatibility through Proton and the Steam Deck ecosystem, that barrier has started to weaken significantly. Many modern games now run on Linux with performance that is comparable to Windows, and in some cases even better due to reduced background overhead. At the same time, developers are increasingly targeting Linux-friendly environments, especially in cloud-native and containerized workflows. Tools like Docker, Kubernetes, and development environments built on Linux-first architectures have made it the preferred platform for software development. This creates a feedback loop where more developers use Linux, which leads to better Linux tools, which in turn attracts even more users. Security is another area where Linux is quietly gaining an advantage. The permission-based architecture, combined with strict separation of user and system processes, makes it inherently more resistant to many types of malware compared to traditional desktop operating systems. When combined with sandboxed applications and read-only system partitions in modern distributions, the attack surface becomes significantly smaller. What makes all of this even more interesting is the timing. We are entering an era where computing is becoming more distributed, cloud-connected, and device-agnostic. The traditional idea of a single desktop operating system being the center of computing is slowly fading. Instead, users interact with multiple devices, cloud services, and remote applications. Linux is naturally positioned for this shift because it already dominates cloud infrastructure and server environments. So when people say Linux just changed forever, it is not about one dramatic announcement. It is about the accumulation of years of innovation reaching a point where everything starts to align. Immutable systems reduce instability. Wayland modernizes graphics. Containerized apps solve dependency chaos. Kernel improvements enhance performance. Gaming support removes one of the last major barriers. Hardware compatibility becomes seamless. And the ecosystem slowly converges into something more unified and user-friendly. If this trajectory continues, the gap between Linux and mainstream desktop operating systems could shrink dramatically over the next few years. Windows and macOS are not going away, and they still have massive ecosystems and loyal user bases. But Linux is no longer the underdog it once was. It is becoming a serious contender not just in servers or development environments, but in everyday personal computing. The real question is not whether Linux can replace Windows or macOS overnight. That is unlikely. The real question is whether the future of computing will become more open, more modular, and more user-controlled. And if that is the direction the industry continues to move in, Linux is already laying the foundation for it. In many ways, this shift represents more than just technology. It represents a philosophy of computing that prioritizes transparency, flexibility, and community-driven progress over closed ecosystems and corporate control. And as more users begin to experience modern Linux distributions that feel polished, fast, and reliable, the perception of what Linux is will continue to evolve. What once required technical knowledge and patience is slowly becoming something that feels natural and intuitive. And that is why this moment feels significant. Not because Linux suddenly defeated its competitors, but because it finally reached a stage where it no longer needs to compete in the same way. It is becoming its own category of computing experience, one that blends freedom with usability in a way that was difficult to achieve in the past. And as this evolution continues, the line between Linux being an alternative and Linux being a mainstream choice will keep getting thinner.